Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Weekend at Bakugo's. This will be Part 5, Chapter 5. Aizawa met them in the hallway and signaled for Kirishima to continue into the common room. Once alone, he briefly glanced at Izuku sitting on Bakugo's shoulders, but just shook his head, deciding not to inquire. The class are all fully briefed, including the suspicion that Midoriya has retained his quirk. They also know that, for all intents and purposes, you're his guardian for the time being, his teacher said quietly, the fatigue evident in his voice. I have also secured promises of best behavior for the weekend. Bakugo grimaced at the threats that may have been leveled to secure promises of best behavior, but he nodded in gratitude. It'll be easier if everyone's on the same page, and he does know Izuku best. You were here earlier, Izuku murmured suddenly from his perch. Aizawa surveyed the toddler sitting atop his student and nodded. I was. And you were in the big room with the really tall man and the giant talking mouse, Izuku stammered a little, and Bakugo smiled at the description of the principal. Izuku took a deep breath and added, Then you left and got Kacchan. I did. Aizawa nodded again. Bakugo felt one of the hands gripping his hair let go, and he turned his head a little to see Izuku reach a hand out. My name's Zuku. Thank you for getting Kacchan, Izuku said with all the formality a 4-year-old could muster. The corner of Aizawa's mouth twitched as he shook the proffered hand. It's very nice to meet you properly, Zuku. You can call me Aizawa. He inclined his head slightly before adding, We thought Kacchan would be the best person. Both Bakugo and his teacher grimaced at the sound of him saying the nickname. They exchanged a glance that made it abundantly clear it would never happen again, thank God. Kacchan is the bestest person, Izuku shouted, as if he couldn't understand how anyone could possibly think different. Bakugo felt his face go pink again, and he was grateful that Aizawa didn't look at him, but instead continued to address Izuku. I'm sure he is, when he wants to be. Bakugo rolled his eyes at that, but Aizawa went on. Now, you're about to meet a lot of new people, Zuku. Are you going to be okay with that? Uh-huh. Who are they? Second-year students of UA's Hero Course, Aizawa explained. Izuku gasped, hands tightening almost painfully in Bakugo's hair, and he could feel the boy practically vibrate with excitement. Forever the nerd. There was a very short squeal when they entered the room, and Bakugo saw Kirishima clamp his hand over Pinky's mouth. Izuku spotted him, too. Kiri! Izuku yelled, throwing both his hands into the air, finally relinquishing his grip on Bakugo's hair. Then he gasped again. Wait, Kiri's a hero? Trying to be, little man, Kirishima said proudly, chest puffed out and every pointed tooth on show. Wow, Izuku whispered in apparent awe of his newfound friend. The rest of the class were quiet but staring, some slack-jawed, some with complete bewilderment written across their faces. Ponytail and round face were both wide-eyed, with their hands over their mouths. Hey, Izuku, Bakugo turned his head to whisper to his charge. Why don't you introduce yourself to everyone? Okie dokie, Kacchan, Izuku whispered back loudly. Bakugo felt his weight shift, and imagined that Izuku was now sitting up as straight as he could. Hello, my name's Zuku, he announced, in the same formal tone he'd used with Aizawa earlier on. Hi, Zuku, everyone chorused. A few people waved. And this is Kacchan. Izuku patted his head. Bakugo's face promised death to anyone who dared repeat the nickname. They had long since learned that it was not something just anyone could call him. But to Izuku he only explained. They know who I am, buddy. I go here too. That's why I could come and get you, and how I know Kirishima. He pointed over to where the redhead still had his hand over Pinky's mouth. He reached up and back to lift Izuku off his shoulders, over his own head. Oh, so Kacchan's gonna be a hero too, Izuku exclaimed as he was set down. Well, duh. Bakugo beckoned Kirishima over to him before squatting down to Izuku's level. We always said we would be, didn't we? Ever since we were old enough to understand what heroes were. Yep, the bestest heroes, Izuku nodded, but uncertainty colored his features. We'll work that out later. Right. Now I'm going to make us some dinner, but I've got a job for you and Kiri. He fished a blank notebook out of his back pocket that he'd swiped from Izuku's room earlier on. I need you to find out everyone's hero names and what their quirks are. He said it loud enough for the rest of the class to hear, and grinned as Izuku's eyes widened. Think you can do that for me? He asked both Izuku and Kirishima. Kirishima nodded with a grin and immediately began looking for something to write with. I can really ask everyone? Izuku whispered, clutching the notebook. Bakugo just nodded and stood as Izuku began bouncing on the balls of his feet. Kirishima reappeared with a pencil. Ready, little man? Yeah! Izuku reached for Kirishima's hand. Can we ask Zawa first? Who? Kirishima frowned as they headed for a sofa. I think he means me, grumbled Aizawa, finally moving into the room from the doorway. Bakugo glared at the rest of the class and hissed. One at a time. Don't make him cry, and watch the language. Then he headed for the kitchen, snagging one of the bags that Aizawa had brought along earlier, and ignored the snickers and whispers behind him. He'd pulled out the ingredients for a basic soup and began chopping veggies. There had been enough to make a big batch, and if he added noodles, there would be more than enough for the class. Bakugo didn't necessarily always articulate very well, but food was how he showed that he didn't necessarily hate you, your face, and everything you stand for. The class had benefited hugely from his cooking over the years, and it calmed him. There was a simple joy in making something and being able to enjoy it, and since starting UA, he discovered that it's something he likes others to enjoy too. Secretly, one of his proudest moments was when Deku had quietly declared that Bakugo's homemade katsudon was better than his own mother's, which he knew was high praise indeed. They'd both practically been raised on Auntie Ingo's cooking after all. He was searing chicken in a frying pan, gently nudging it around with a spatula, when Aizawa joined him in the kitchen. There was a big pot of broth and veggies simmering on the stove ring next to it, steam curling languidly from the surface. Is he done quizzing you? Bakugo asked, unable to completely fight off his grin. It's interesting to learn that Midoriya has always been this intense when it comes to quirks. A lot of things about him make more sense. He's captured Uraraka now, Aizawa answered, smiling slightly. Bakugo looked up to see Round-Face levitating a mug in front of Deku's shining face. He grinned and went back to concentrating on not overdoing the meat. I would like you to bring Midoriya to Ground Beta tomorrow morning, 9:30, Aizawa said after a short pause, causing Bakugo to nearly flip a piece of chicken clean out of the pan. What? Why? Aizawa shrugged. Curiosity, mostly. Bakugo's mouth fell open in spite of himself. You've got to be fucking with me, man. But also, because I and the principal want to ensure that Midoriya will be safe here for the duration of the situation. Aizawa held up a hand as Bakugo opened his mouth to protest. This is not a judgment on you or your abilities. Our intel was incorrect about him not retaining his quirk. If it turns out that we are wrong about the 3-day timescale, then we need to be fully aware of what we're dealing with, to be able to make appropriate arrangements. Bakugo stopped stirring. He hadn't considered the possibility that Deku could end up stuck like this. It's all fun and games for a weekend. A good story to tell later, but having to start over from 4 years old? Fuck. Does the quirk allow him to age? What if he doesn't and he ends up actually stuck? You're going to burn the chicken, Aizawa interrupted. Sizzling assaulted his ears, and he eased his white-knuckled grip on the spatula. Shit, he mumbled as he reached for the soy sauce and splashed some into the pan and stirred everything around. He also threw the noodles into the broth. They'd only need a few minutes. It is only a precaution. There's nothing indicating the intel is wrong, and it's being double-checked as we speak. Aizawa attempted to reassure him. Bakugo stayed mute and added honey to the soy sauce-covered chicken and turned the heat up slightly. They both watched as the honey and soy sauce began to caramelize and the chicken became sticky and almost glazed. That looks very good, Aizawa said, still gazing intently at the contents of the frying pan. Bakugo grunted. His teacher nodded and began to head to the door, to leave the dorms before saying, 9:30 a.m., Ground Beta, don't forget. When he only got a nod in response, he added, Bring Kirishima too. He could be useful. Bakugo nodded again and then blurted out, If you want to try it, I can set aside a bowl. It was one of the very few times he'd seen his teacher truly smile. That would be much appreciated, Bakugo. Mike's cooking, to be frank, sucks. Kaminari bounced into the kitchen as Aizawa left. Smells super good, bro. Is there... Yes, there's enough for everyone. Bakugo sighed as he threw a hand towel over his shoulder, turned the stove off, and moved everything off the heat. You people would starve if I didn't feed you. You know, that might be true, but if you didn't want to feed us, you shouldn't make it taste so good, man. Kaminari slapped his shoulder. Don't touch me while I'm cooking, asshat, he grumbled. Just give me some bowls out of the cupboard. Thankfully, Pikachu did as he was told. setting them next to the kiddie bowl that Aizawa had provided for Izuku, and Bakugo began spooning chicken into each one as it was set down. They'd got to the last one without incident until Kaminari turned to sniff at the broth and collided with Bakugo, sending the last bits of chicken all over the countertop. "Fuck's sake, dunceface, watch!" Bakugo started, brandishing the spoon. "Fuck's sake, dunceface!" The room went silent as every head turned to Izuku, who was now, for some reason, stood on the table in the center. "No!" Bakugo shouted back on instinct, pointing the spoon at Izuku instead. "Fuck no!" Izuku shouted back again, grinning from ear to ear with mischief written all over his little face. Bakugo picked his jaw up from the floor and threw his towel under the counter. He turned to Kaminari and pointed to the chicken still littered across the countertop. "That lot's yours. Don't try to give it to someone else." Then he turned to where Izuku was still standing on the table. The little boy was still grinning widely and looked poised to run. "Thought I gave you a job to do." Bakugo began to stalk forwards. "You were supposed to find out everyone's hero names and quirks." The class was looking back and forth between the two of them, as if unsure as to whether this was a game or not yet. "Me and Kiri got everyone's." Izuku put his hands on his hips and stood his ground, or table. Bakugo spotted Sero by the doors that led to the outside. He caught his eye and inclined his head. "Open the doors." Sero grinned at him, unlatched them, and swung them wide. "You got everyone's." "Well, you did that very, very fast." Bakugo was nearly on him now, Izuku's head craning back to look him in the eye. "Should I ask Kirishima for the notebook, so I can have a look?" He turned his back on Izuku, and Bakugo heard him gasp. "Run, Kiri!" Izuku squealed. Kirishima hadn't realized he'd be part of the game, but he only hesitated for just long enough to say, "Sorry, bro," to Bakugo before he vaulted over the back of the sofa and hauled ass into the fresh air outside. There was a splintering crack from behind Bakugo. A flash of green passed him, and then Izuku was hot on Kirishima's heels, giggling madly. Bakugo turned around just in time to see the table fold in on itself, along the break in the middle. "Dunceface," he called. "Yo!" "Put one big ladle of broth and noodles in each of the bowls. Put one in the fridge for Aizawa-sensei, the rest are all up for grabs, but there's not enough for seconds." He reeled off as if he were giving orders to troops. "Understood, bro. Will do," Kaminari called back and started rummaging in the drawers for the ladle. Bakugo made for the doors before he was stopped by Icy Hot. "I wish to offer my assistance in the retrieval of such a valuable artifact." Todoroki deadpanned. Bakugo rolled his eyes but nodded. Almost as an afterthought, he turned to the rest of the class and threw his arms wide. "Anyone else want in?" This seemed to be the cue they'd been waiting for. The class whooped and charged outside to join the hunt. For a fucking notebook with next to nothing in it. The hunt quickly devolved into a quirk-filled game of hide-and-seek. They'd found Izuku and Kirishima relatively quickly. One was a fidgety 4-year-old, and one was a fidgety Kirishima. Hiding was neither's strong point. Bakugo and Todoroki had them cornered. Then Todoroki had frozen Bakugo's feet to the ground and encased him in ice up to his elbows. "I should have known you'd be a traitor," Bakugo spat as Todoroki flicked him between the eyes. Bakugo bared his teeth and growled. Was this whole thing a setup? "What should we do with him, Zuku?" Kirishima asked their diminutive leader, arms folded across his chest. Izuku surveyed Bakugo before tugging on Kirishima's trouser leg. He bent down to let Izuku whisper in his ear. "That's all. You sure, little man?" Kirishima asked. "Uh-huh. He's cooked for us. We can't be mean," said Izuku, holding out his hand with the palm up. Bakugo had expected Kirishima to take it, but instead he handed over the notebook and pencil. Izuku clutched them both to him and toddled over to where Bakugo was still a popsicle. He sat down, laid the notebook out on the floor with a blank page. What the fuck is going on? "Kacchan, what's your quirk?" The whole thing was a fucking setup. He's 4, fully quirked, and diabolical. Bakugo had managed to convince Izuku to ask Todo to unfreeze him so they could go back in and eat, and because it was bloody cold, but it had taken Bakugo promising and promising to answer all of Izuku's questions about his quirk. Meanwhile, he tried not to feel too disheartened by the fact that it appeared that Izuku couldn't remember anything about it. Having worked up an appetite, running around outside like the kids they'd been only a short time ago, the bowls of soup vanished quickly. Kaminari declared that he and Bakugo should be let off of doing the dishes as the empty bowls started to pile up around the sink. "Huh? What the hell did you do?" Bakugo shouted at him from across the room where he was helping Izuku with his broth. "I served it all up!" Kaminari cried indignantly. While this was not comparable to the effort that Bakugo had put in, it was still more than the rest of them had contributed. It all seemed pretty even, too, and he put some extra veggies into Izuku's and Aizawa's bowls. By the time Izuku had finished, the rest of the dishes had been done, and the class were debating what movie to watch to finish their Friday off. "No horror stuff," he grumbled to Pinky. "I ain't dealing with nightmares." Good point." She shoved the horror movie box back in the cupboard and pulled out their collection of animated films instead. They ended up with a musical or something or other that Earphones insisted was a classic. He went to wash up Izuku's kiddie bowl instead, leaving him to play on the floor with some of Aries' old toys. Bakugo placed the bowl on the drainer to dry and turned the lights off in the kitchen, plunging the whole room into darkness, so the only light came from the TV. Instead of rejoining the group, he headed for the bedrooms. He was going to move his mattress into Izuku's room and sleep on the floor for the weekend. That way Deku can stay in his room where it's familiar. The first trip saw the mattress stowed snugly between the legs of Izuku's bed and his chest of drawers. The second trip saw Bakugo's bedding added to the mattress and his satchel, containing a change of clothes and some toiletries, stashed in Izuku's wardrobe. He was just setting the alarm on Izuku's clock when the door opened. "There you are, dude. We'd wondered where you got to," Kirishima whispered as he opened the door. "Little man fell asleep, and movie's just finished, so we're all off to bed." Behind Kirishima, Bakugo saw Shoji, cradling a sleeping Izuku in his many arms and ponytail holding a bundle of clothes. "Should I just put him on the bed?" Shoji asked quietly. Bakugo nodded and beckoned him into the room. Shoji deposited the toddler gently on top of the blankets, being careful not to dislodge the roll guard Bakugo had installed earlier. "I made these for him. Thought they might help." Ponytail handed him a small pile of boys' clothing and a nightlight. Thanks, that's, you didn't have to," Bakugo stammered. "You've really got to stop referring to her as Ponytail." "We had to look in the bags that Aizawa dropped off. The toys are fine and all, but the clothes," Kirishima said with a grimace. "We thought Izuku would appreciate something more his style," interrupted Ponytail. Yayorozu, tactfully. Kirishima nodded fervently. "Oh, and here's your phone back." He added Bakugo's phone to the pile, as Shoji sidled back out of the room. "Thanks again, to all of you." Yayorozu smiled, and Shoji inclined his head before bidding both him and Kirishima good night, and heading off to their rooms. "I best be off too, bro. I'm dead on my feet. Been a long day, huh?" Kirishima yawned widely. "Yeah, no shit," Bakugo mumbled, yawning in response. He was just about to retreat into Izuku's room when he remembered. "You up for some training tomorrow? Aizawa wants Izuku, you, and me at ground beta for 9:30 in the morning, looking at Izuku's quirk and stuff." "Absolutely, man, but that means I have to go to sleep right now." Kirishima slapped Bakugo's shoulder and headed to his door. "See you at breakfast." Bakugo gave a thumbs up to the back of Kirishima's head and entered Izuku's room. He used the light in the bathroom to inspect what Yayorozu had made for Izuku. On top was a pair of All Might pajamas. Well, guaranteed he's going to love those. Next was a pair of cargo shorts, exact miniatures of Izuku's usual dreadful style. Then were 2 small cotton t-shirts, one light blue and one white. Both had T-shirt written across the front. "That's the cutest thing I've ever seen. The only thing missing is those god-awful red shoes." Bakugo brushed his teeth and flickered through the pictures Kirishima had taken that day. The first one he saw, the last one of the day, was of himself up to his elbows in ice, talking to Izuku, who was sitting on the floor in front of him. The rest were mostly of Izuku talking to his classmates with a rapt expression on his face. One showed Izuku floating several inches off the floor with Uraraka standing behind him. When the fuck did that happen? There were also several of himself while he was cooking. He stopped when he got to the first one, that Kirishima had taken in the hallway. Kirishima was grinning brightly as always, while he himself was wide-eyed and bewildered, but Izuku on his shoulders looked fit to burst with excitement. Bakugo hadn't seen him that happy in a very long time. Deku was plenty cheery, but sheer, unbridled joy wasn't a common occurrence, not anymore. As he climbed onto his mattress and put his phone on to charge, he heard Izuku's quiet breathing, the steady in and out of someone sleeping soundly. Bakugo settled in and allowed heaviness to creep up his body, into his limbs, and into his eyelids. His breathing fell into step alongside Izuku's, and he succumbed to sleep quicker and easier than he had in a long while. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 5 of Weekend at Bakugo's. Chapter 6 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one. I really like how Izuku got to meet the classmates in this one, so I thought this chapter was really great. Eager to hear your thoughts and reactions as always. Thank you so much for listening.